For decades, the world has poured literal billions of dollars into developing nations, and the results have been, well, incredibly mixed. In this explainer, we're going to completely rethink how media can actually be used to transform societies straight from the ground up. We are diving into a fascinating field known as development communication. Historically, immense resources have been funneled into these massive top-down campaigns that frankly just miss the mark when they finally reach the everyday people they're meant to help. So today we're exploring a framework that asks a really fundamental question. What if we stopped using media to manipulate the masses and instead started using it to empower the silent majority?
So, I want to kick things off with a bit of a provocative question, something that really challenges our fundamental assumptions about progress as a society. What does it actually mean to develop? When you hear politicians, economists, or global organizations talking about development on the evening news, you almost always hear them speaking in strict numbers, right? They tout employment rates, quarterly export figures, and most famously, the gross national product, or GNP. But we really have to ask ourselves, is that actually development, or is that just accounting?
When we think about progress, we usually picture pure economic development, the factories, the infrastructure, the gross national product. But true human development is about social justice, interchange, and moral values. As the pioneer thinkers in this field realized pretty quickly, a larger economic pie means absolutely nothing without equitable distribution. You can build all the multi-lane highways and towering skyscrapers you want, but if a society lacks basic social justice, relative peace, and ethical grounding, that so-called development just doesn't make sense to the common people. People have to have a tangible, decent share of what they produced to actually be motivated to participate in their society. In short, true development really means developing people.
All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer today. 1. Beyond just economic growth. 2. Defining development communication. 3. Global schools of DevCom. 4. Pioneers in the Philippines. 5. The 5 Eyes framework. And finally, 6. Communication for human empowerment.
Okay, let's jump right into our first section, beyond just economic growth and deconstructing the GNP myth.
There's this fantastic quote from Gennaro V. Ong Jr., a highly prominent and early voice in this space, and he captured the core problem perfectly. He said, "It doesn't help much to increase the size of the economic pie if 90% of it still goes to only 10% of the people." I mean, think about that for a second. If all the financial gains of a nation are hoarded right at the very top, the condition of the vast, rapidly growing majority at the bottom isn't going to improve. Actually, due to inflation and resource scarcity, it's going to grow worse. A person can live in a remarkably wealthy country, surrounded by immense industrial output, and still be utterly destitute if they are systematically left out of the equation. To truly progress, it is absolutely crucial that we bridge the gap between economic policy and actual human betterment. Moving right along to Section 2. Defining development communication as a tool for social service. So, back in 1971, a pioneer named Nora Cruz Quibrel coined this term, and I absolutely love her definition because it anchors communication directly to action. She called it the art and science of human communication linked to a society's planned transformation for greater equity and the unfolding of individual potential. Notice the specific wording there. It's both an art and a science. It requires the scientific rigor of sociological research combined with the artistic empathy of a storyteller. Most importantly, it's linked to a planned transformation and the unfolding of individual potential. It isn't just about assisting development from the sidelines, it's an active, vital process happening right in the trenches, with the specific goal of moving a society from poverty to dynamic, equitable growth. Now, let's look at the stark contrast between mass communication and social communication. Mass communication, which we're all incredibly familiar with, often acts as top-down propaganda, right? It treats people as passive objects, a mass, to be molded, marketed to, and manipulated into buying a product or adopting a belief. Development communication, however, operates as social communication. It is inherently bottom-up. It respects human dignity and aims for a free, conscious, and voluntary human response. You simply cannot manipulate people into developing themselves. You can try to provide a stimulus from the outside, like a new agricultural technique or maybe a health initiative. But the true impetus, the drive to actually adopt that change, has to come voluntarily from within the individual. That brings us to Section 3, Global Schools of DevCom, taking an impartial look at its history. Tracking how this idea evolved globally is honestly fascinating because it didn't just pop up in one place overnight. It was forged through trial and error across entirely different continents. In 1944, the Bretton Woods School heavily favored a Western, top-down approach. The prevailing thought then was that modern industrial capitalism and media infrastructure could just be copy-pasted into developing nations and, boom, automatically produce wealth. Well, it didn't work. But researchers and activists in Latin America pushed back. As early as the 1940s, they were pioneering participatory rural radio, using basic broadcasting not to preach to farmers but to connect marginalized groups so they could share their own agricultural solutions. By the 1960s, African post-colonial movements were using local radio and community theater for grassroots education. And finally, in 1971, the University of the Philippines Los Baños formalized all of these global lessons into a strict academic discipline. To put this into perspective, consider the story of miracle rice in the Philippines in the 1960s. Father Cornelio Lagerwey, another founder of the DevCom movement, sat with international scientists who had cultivated this high-yield crop. They had amazing, world-changing data in their laboratories. But when Lagerwey looked at the actual rural farmers, he realized a massive gap existed. The knowledge was locked inside the research institute, while ignorance remained out in the field. Merely broadcasting that miracle rice existed wasn't nearly enough. If you don't actively educate the people on the specific planting techniques, water requirements, and harvesting methods in their own local language, the breakthrough remains completely useless to them. It's just a neat item on the evening news, completely failing to help the common farmer actually put food on the table. Or take a look at this very costly historical example from India in the late 1960s. Massive international aid was provided to control population growth, and thousands of family planning clinics were rapidly built across the country. The logistical rollout was huge. The problem? The women they were intended for simply didn't show up. Because the target audience wasn't consulted or involved in the process, they had zero inner motivation to participate. Panicked by the lack of attendance, the government actually resorted to bribing citizens with transistor radios and eventually outright coercion. The program failed spectacularly, human rights were violated, and the ruling political party ended up losing the subsequent election.
Father Lagerwey brilliantly summed up these top-down failures when he noted, "People are not coffee. You can't just mix them with water and expect instant results. Development requires painstaking preparation, deep cultural understanding, and the active participation of the very people you are trying to help. You have to earn their trust and cultivate their understanding before you can expect any real societal shift." Let's shift over to Section 4, Pioneers in the Philippines, which really became the academic powerhouse for all of this. It was in the Philippines that development communication truly found its structured academic footing. Nora Cruz Cabral and her colleagues at the University of the Philippines Los Baños realized that traditional journalism programs just weren't enough to solve developing world problems. So they built a totally unique curriculum. Picture a student learning how to operate a broadcasting camera and write compelling copy in the morning, and then heading out to the fields to take advanced electives in agriculture, forestry, and nutrition in the afternoon. They fused hard technical sciences with heavy sociological grounding. This created a completely new breed of professional equipped to catalyze social change. Someone who had the scientific knowledge of what to say combined with the sociological empathy of why they were saying it. They championed communication not as marketing but as a non-formal education process that develops a person's ability to make sound decisions for themselves.
Okay, let's dive into Section 5, the 5 Eyes framework. This is a very tangible methodology you can actually use. So, if you want to put development communication into practice, how do you actually do it? Well, the CFA Media Group developed a highly practical, democratic journey called the 5 Eyes. Let's say you want to introduce a new, life-saving water filtration system to a rural village. First, you inform. You don't just drop off a manual. You do the research and translate the engineering specs into the local sociocultural language. Second, you instruct. You use clear, accessible visual aids so the community actually understands how the filter works mechanically. Third, and this is absolutely the heart of good communication, you inspire. You don't just use dry data, you use local stories and dramas that speak to the heart and the will, showing how clean water will protect their children. Fourth, you insist. Motivation requires continuous, gentle, persuasive impulses over time to remove any lingering community doubts. And finally, you involve. This is the ultimate goal, folks. You hand over the maintenance and management of the water system to the village itself, giving back self-confidence and human dignity so the people can take action independently. And this brings us to our final section, Section 6, Communication for Human Empowerment, the ultimate goal. Underneath all those economic charts, the academic curriculums, and the mass media strategies, the true heart of DevCom is simply human liberation. Over the decades, Nora Cruz Cabral noted that the global definition of development continually expanded. It started strictly with economics, then it rightly added social, cultural, and governance aspects. Today, it even encompasses peace building and environmental sustainability. But the bottom line never wavered. No matter what new media tools we invent, from the rural radios of the 1940s to the smartphones of today, the goal is never to manipulate a passive audience. The goal is to act as a catalyst for the realization of human potential. So I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on as you look at the media and public messaging in your own life today. Are the messages you consume daily treating you as an object to be molded or as a human being with immense potential to unfold? And more importantly, when you communicate with others, whether that's in your workplace, your local government, or just your neighborhood, how will you use these principles to inform, instruct, inspire, insist, and ultimately involve them? Development communication is much more than an academic framework. It is ultimately a science of hope, rooted in a profound belief in the power of the silent majority.